We are going to discuss, it's a case study of a DAS in the French Quarter, thanks to Crown Castle, who is presenting the study, and also who is the exclusive networking reception sponsor tonight. I want to introduce you to our three panelists. From Crown Castle, we have Serge McAuliffe, who is the Director of DAS Sales. We have Larry Hesdorfer, yay, with the Ville Carré Commission in New Orleans, which oversees all external alterations to buildings in the district. And we have Daniel Lund, a partner at the New Orleans law firm of Shield, Mott & Lund, and he is engaged in general civil litigation, focusing primarily on construction industry and surety matters, products liability, telecommunications law, and zoning. So I hope you enjoy this discussion, and I believe that our panelists would like this to be interactive, so if you have questions, certainly raise your hand up and we can get a microphone over to you to talk. I think that this is, I went on the walking tour yesterday just to take a look at it, and I think it's a really interesting deployment in a couple of phases, and really shows how you can balance the best of keeping a flavor of an area with the benefits of economic development. So with that, I'll turn it over to Serge.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tracy. Hopefully you can hear me. I've been told to talk right into the microphone. Good afternoon. I appreciate everybody joining us today. What we're here to talk about today is Crown Castle's French Quarter DAS Network. And we talked about we needed music right there in the fanfare. But joining me today, as mentioned, is Daniel Lund. So Daniel is local to New Orleans and has represented Crown Castle in obtaining our jurisdictional approval to build in the French Quarter area. So Dan will talk a little bit more detail in just a minute. And then we're very happy to have with us today Larry Hesdorfer from the Ville Carré Commission, and to give us a perspective on how the DAS network has been received by people that live in the French Quarter, work in the French Quarter, and a lot of us that play in the French Quarter. So what I thought I'd start off with is just talk a little bit about why a DAS, what drove the need for a DAS in the French Quarter. And typically what drives the need for a DAS is there's two different issues. There's one is coverage. And those of us been in the French Quarter, we all been down there, and you know that the streets are narrow and it's somewhat tight, and you have buildings on both sides, 3- or 4-story buildings. And so providing coverage in that area is tough. And typically a carrier needing to get that type of coverage would want to put some towers, 2 or 3 towers, and being from Crown Castle, we'd be happy to provide towers as needed. But unfortunately, it's a historic district. You're not going to get a tower in the French Quarter. So what most of the carriers have done is they've gone on towers down by the river, and they're trying to blast coverage into the French Quarter. And it's just difficult. You have all the buildings, it creates shadowing, and you just don't get the coverage that's needed. The second item that can drive a DAS network is capacity. And again, those of us who've been in the French Quarter, we know as it gets later in the day, goes into the night, it gets busier and busier. And as you get towards the weekend, Thursday, Friday, you get into the weekend, and it just gets packed in the French Quarter. And then you have events, such as this one. You have these conferences. Most of us are going to be in the French Quarter at some point. If I know some of them already been there. So, but then you have the conventions. You have the Saints football games. You got Mardi Gras every year. We got Jazz Fest starting this coming weekend. You've got Sugar Bowl, and then a couple of months ago, of course, was the Super Bowl. So all these events, you've got all these people into that particular area, small area, packed area. They're taking pictures, they're taking videos. There's a lot of things happening in the French Quarter we know about. So it really drives the capacity, and it keeps growing and growing. So for the French Quarter, it was basically both of these issues that drove the need. You had the capacity need as well as the coverage need. So back in 2007, Crown Castle built 14 nodes in the French Quarter, and at that time we had a single carrier on the system. But over the years we've added additional carriers, so we added 2 additional carriers to those 14 nodes, and then last year in preparation for the Super Bowl we built 13 additional nodes, and we got 2 carriers on those nodes. So now we have a total of 27 nodes in the French Quarter, and you're going to see some of those later this afternoon, those of you that join us, and they just blend in, and that was part of the whole process of getting this built in the French Quarter. And At this point, I'd like to, let Daniel take over and talk a little bit about what it took to get built. We had the need, then we had to get the approval to build in this historic district. And I'd like, Dan to talk about, working with the City of New Orleans and then the Vieux-Carré Commission and how that process worked.
Sure, thank you. And I appreciate everyone being here. A tour of the nodes, if you believe they put the nodes where the people are in the French Quarter, a tour of the nodes to me equates to bar hopping. And so I'm guessing that's what we're going to be doing after this. One of the things that you mentioned just now, Serge, about visiting and noticing when coverage was having problems, and you mentioned Saints games, which is, although we'll have a bunch of folks come in for a Saints game from out of town, one of the things about the French Quarter that is maybe different than some people anticipate is that it's very first residential. A lot of residents live down there, and then a lot of the locals in New Orleans visit the French Quarter on a regular basis, I being one of them, because it's a fun place to be. It's historic. It's just a wonderful place, and so we're driven by a lot of considerations that aren't necessarily spiked only because of tourist activities, Super Bowls and things like that, but certainly the Super Bowl led us in part to this latest development. But in the initial stages, when the DAS was first proposed, which was actually, I think, back in 2003, you had a case of first impression. There weren't a lot of distributed antenna systems of the type and kind for the French Quarter residents and the Vieux-Carré Commission to look at. So it was important that we came in representing Crown and helped convince the folks in the French Quarter that they needed this system. This wasn't simply a matter of a Telecommunications Act approach where we said we're entitled to put this in and we're going to do it because we're entitled to have coverage there. That was never going to work, and we didn't ever try to employ that. But we had to appeal to their sensibilities about knowing why they needed the coverage, why they needed ultimately additional bandwidth. And to put this new concept in. So there were a lot of different designs that were considered. At some point, it was going to be all stop signs. Earlier than that, I think it was going to be all light standards. And adaptability was really critical for Crown at the time because this group, Larry's group, and then the citizens group, and there's several different citizens group, business owners associations and residents associations in the Vieux-Carré who have an interest in this and want to make sure that what's being placed is going to be acceptable, not only functionally, but certainly visibly. The aesthetics are a key matter. And what you'll see tonight, and I expect that we'll probably see both some of the first nodes that were built and the more recent, is the development from the way the first set of nodes looked to the second set. The second set looked a little bit better, if you will, and that gets us to the second approval because I think it was probably in what you said, 07 or 08, that the first set of nodes was built. And then we went back to the Vieux-Carré Commission and said, well, we want to put some more. And of course, you get initial pushback, not so much from Larry's office, but from interested parties who say, you want more? Why wasn't it enough before? And so you've got to go back through this process of educating why more nodes are needed. In this case, it was because we didn't have complete coverage throughout the quarter. And if you look at a map of where all 27 nodes are located, you'll see that we've really filled in some spots. And then there was the need to have additional bandwidth to cover the new services. And frankly, we were dealing with, at that point in time, somewhat of a known commodity, which was very helpful because the folks said, you put in the first set of nodes, you told us they would function in a certain way, you told us they would look a certain way, and essentially that's what we've got. And when you tell us now that you need more because more carriers want to come on and you've got more services you want to offer and you need the bandwidth, we've read about that and we understand that. But it's still imperative for us to continue to work with them. And when we got with the locals on this, we said, what would be the most helpful item to bring in terms of photo simulations or a full-scale mock-up to a meeting at Larry's offices, and we brought this. This is not a full-size piece of cast iron, but what you'll notice today when you look at the old nodes versus the new nodes is that the old nodes are a little bit bigger around in diameter and have a fiberglass sheath on the outside held together by at least two metal bands wrapped around that. good-looking structure, looks like French Quarter. Nobody knows it's there, but we were able this time, because of increases or changes in technology, to go with a smaller diameter pole and to use cast iron. And when we were able to pass this around to the folks at the meetings and say, we're going to use this material instead, this is something that appeals to French Quarter folks, cast iron. They prefer this to plastic or to fiberglass. And ultimately, we got the next set of nodes through. There was one other component to this, and that is that as a part of the first approval and as part of this second approval as well, we had to deal with a franchise ordinance with the City of New Orleans. Larry's agency, correct me if I'm wrong, is an agency of the City of New Orleans.
That's correct.
Okay,
yeah.
But we're dealing now with City Hall, and folks who are less interested in this don't really have a frame of reference for what it is we're doing, and we have to get this franchise ordinance amended. That entails first going to the office of the city attorney, and they take the document and they run through it and they make changes to it. Then they send it on to the technology department at the city. Well, I've got to tell you that sometimes the wheels over there don't work as fast as the wheels of the Vieux-Carré Commission, and things may not be proceeding in parallel. And as a result, you've got to be ready as a carrier to sort of adapt to that, because we were dealing with the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl was not going to change its date depending on whether the City of New Orleans was ready to sign its ordinance or not. And we were able to work with all the groups together collectively to make sure that we got the second set of nodes built and turned on in time for the Super Bowl.
To try to, I knew they were going to cover all the technical stuff, so I consider myself part of the local color here. To put some of this in perspective, and I assume that a lot of you perhaps are not first-time visitors to New Orleans, but when you come to New Orleans, and especially when you come to the French Quarter, you know you're not in a place that's like any other in the United States. So I'm going to give a little bit of the historical context and the whys and wherefores about that, not so much to teach history lessons, believe me, I don't want to drag this on. But more importantly, I'm sure that there will be a time, or many times, when different people will have projects that will approach areas of sensitivity. The Vieux-Carré, which simply means old square, for any of you who are wondering why we've got a funny name like that. I don't know what they called it before someone decided to call it the old square, but it was probably, it was just a worthy French term that was evolved from Creole colonial days, because, you know, New Orleans was French, then it was Spanish, then it was French, then it came part of this United States, and then for a short, unpleasant period of the Confederacy, and then back to the United States. But in 1936, a sort of earth-shaking event took place in the Louisiana legislature, and that was to approve a referendum to go in front of all of the voters of the state to amend the Constitution, because it was determined it was necessary to protect the French Quarter, because it was the original city of New Orleans. And so we now have well over 75 years of this historic protective attitude. It was no less protective in 2003 when this process started for the DAS. But the idea is that the commission that I represent is an agency of the City of New Orleans, but enabled by the state constitution to regulate all kinds of exterior or external changes to all of the buildings that are privately owned in the Vieux-Carré. What set this particular process apart, or partly what prompted it, was someone might have initiated an idea of putting antenna on lots of individual buildings. We have approximately 2,000 properties in the French Quarter, and that translates into about 3,000 buildings. Imagine if you had to go through an initial review with an architectural historic agency such as mine, and evaluate 1 and then 13 additional or 12 additional locations, and each one having particular detailed concerns about the wheres and the whys, and how you would install an antenna, what it would look like, and where it would be placed. And I think the wisdom of this process, and I really, it actually preceded my tenure as director. The first initial reviews took place a few months before I came on the job. But the determination was to try to look at how to do that in the public rights-of-way, so as not to tamper with the historic buildings. All those buildings have ratings. They're all considered of varying significance. And so therefore, the attempt was directed to look at the streets, look at the sidewalks, look at public rights-of-way, and figure out how to do something that could work for the entire district and would also be aesthetically acceptable. And as Dan mentioned, there was an attempt of trying to do something that looked like they were sign poles or that they were lamp poles. And we have an iconic lamp post in the French Quarter that has been around since the 1920s. And the attempt, each of those attempts had certain merits, but they were kicked around by our architectural committee, which is made up of 3 licensed AIA members from the local architectural community, and who really were working with the designers for the system to say, what can you do to accommodate this? How can we accommodate that? How can we make this not an affront to the sensibilities of French Quarter owners, French Quarter visitors, observers of any type? And it ultimately boiled down to, instead of trying to camouflage the system by attaching it to other things, ultimately meant creating these individual units to house the receiver transmitters. And this is where I'm losing technically, so forgive me, because it didn't matter to us. It was how it looked. The part of how it worked has been proven out by, and believe me, there was enough discussion and there were enough eyes and ears and mouths who were addressing these concerns, because during the design process we had a lot of input, and because we're a public agency, nothing we do is behind closed doors. They're all we have a series, well, we have reports on every property we deal with, and all of the most important decisions, unless it's the more mundane things that happen only at staff level, if we send something to a meeting, it is going to be a public advertised event. And as you find with sensitive neighborhoods, and the French Quarter is certainly that, we have watchdogs, and we have property owners, and we have businesses and merchants, and any number of parties who are attentive to every time something's proposed. So we had some fairly lengthy and heated discussions that ultimately resulted in the issuance of a permit for all of these, 13 initial installations. The curious part was, and it took a while, as Dan alluded to, the design was sort of set up, and then it took a while for installation to actually take place. And once they started going in, it was as if a lot of people had never heard about any of the hearings to begin with. So then we started getting calls like, what is this? Why is it there? What is it doing? And I would find myself going out and eavesdropping on people who would be standing and looking at one of these little towers and trying to, tell their friend or associate what it really was. It was Big Brother checking out who was coming to the French Quarter and what they were doing, or they were weather signals that were, reporting on just how dry or wet one corner of the quarter might be, and any number of all descriptions of functions which had nothing to do with the fact. Fast forward perhaps a year at the most. What had been a discussion for a lot of forums and what had been a topic for a great deal of concern suddenly became a part of the landscape. And you have to keep in mind, or at least we keep in mind, you have to know, that agencies such as mine, while we are very involved in aesthetic decisions and appropriateness or making something look as though it fits into the scene, it doesn't mean that an agency of a historic district preservation group or a neighborhood design group or an entity like that is going to say no absolutely to any of these kinds of technologies. Actually, the most important thing to make these neighborhoods survive and and continue to be living, breathing parts of cities is to be able to accommodate modern life. And just in the same way that we have to make sure that people can provide air conditioning and have electrical service and all kinds of modern conveniences while still using all of the historic structures that we're required to protect, that same kind of thought process went in to the DAS installation. And the end of the day is that it is no more a subject for discussion. It is really something that we can look back at saying, sure, it may have been anxiety creating at the initial hearings, but the end result is that they work. Moving into this last year, 2012, and looking forward to the Super Bowl, which is only one of any number of massive opportunities for the throngs of people to flood into the Vieux Carré. Believe me, every Saints game is an opportunity, and every Saints game that they win is an even greater opportunity. But New Orleans is a mecca for visitors, and visitors can't come here without being in the French Quarter. And the numbers of people simply were overloading systems before. So in looking at the second go-around, if you will, this past year, our concerns were, how can we make what we view as a success from the past, how can we make that better? And as Dan pointed out, the cast iron sample is so reminiscent of columns that are on buildings that, again, it helps make it part of the landscape. It helps it blend in and not stand out as some unwanted barnacle in an area that we pride ourselves on being the sort of the gem of the major gem inside the crown. So the next go round is that as these things evolve again and as they become improved upon, and in time one system always becomes outmoded and another one takes its place, we'll be looking at how you guys can improve upon this for the next time. But this is an indication of what you all can do when you go into a situation and say, how do we make something as accommodating to our host as it is to our user?
Thank you very much. A couple observations. Just one of the things that I observed, it was a couple of months ago, Crown Castle was here and we had a sales meeting. And we had an opportunity to go and do a tour, and I was showing some of my colleagues some of the DAS nodes. And we walked up to one, and I pointed it out and was telling them about it. And then it was interesting, one of the locals kind of came up, noticed that, and came up to us. And he pointed at a Jesus statue, and he says, "You see that light on that Jesus statue?" And I go, "Yeah." And he said, "This right here is a generator that energizes that light for the Jesus statue." And we said, "Yes, it does. That's great." And we moved on.
One other side note is the I don't know if we're going to get that far on the tour, but the statue that you're speaking about is in St. Anthony's Garden behind the cathedral, and the sidebar to that is that at night there is a light, and that it casts a remarkable shadow on the back of the cathedral that is sometimes referred to as Touchdown Christ, because Christ's arms are outspread and the shadow looks very much like he's refereeing a game. But early on, see, I told you I was supposed to add a little local color. Early on, the first node was installed about 35 or 40 feet, I think, from where the one is now. And it was the one node that prompted the greatest amount of response because it seemed to be too prominent in the perfect spot for the photograph of the statue of Christ against the backdrop of the rear wall of the cathedral. And so what maybe I shouldn't advertise this because you all would prefer not, but in a move of great conciliatory gesture, I guess you could say, it was moved. Without regard, I don't think, at least no balking terribly about expense, but in terms of bringing a response from the public and the recognition that, you know, we made a point of noting that every location for each node would be surveyed and reviewed to make sure that there really were no problems for anyone. This is the one that didn't have any individual problems. It just had problems for everybody who wanted to take photos. And so it was moved, and again, sort of like the best case scenario of smoothing ruffled feathers, this was ideal. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. One thing I would say, and I'm real comfortable saying this, is, you know, as we go through the tour this afternoon and walk around, and then as we go to Bourbon Street for the reception, and then spread out from there, you're going to have great coverage. Your phones are going to work. You can take your pictures. I feel comfortable saying that because of the placement of the nodes, the carriers on the system, and the way it's set up. So I feel comfortable saying that. Any questions?
Questions from the audience? Anyone? Anyone?
Don't be bashful.
Randy.
Serge, how would you say your experience here compares or contrasts with the other types of venues you've done, like Disney World or big athletic stadiums where you're dealing with multiple entities, and how did that all go? And I think about what you said, 2003, Hurricane Katrina. You know, how did that affect the deployment?
Yeah, we started it pre-Katrina is what we started to develop the design and start working through the process. And then, of course, Katrina hit, and it slowed everything down for quite a while. Everybody was a little bit nervous about putting money back in and you know, waiting to see the tourists. And so at that point, once that started to, the carriers felt more comfortable and they started seeing the demand rise again, they were willing to move forward, and then we worked through the process. To talk about how it compares to other areas, I mean, everyone's unique. Every project is unique. That's one thing. Is, you know, when you're building a DAS, it's not cookie cutter. You know, some areas, you know, you have the historical district, and you have to work with different entities to get the approval process. Then there's others that are very simple. You can do fiber above ground, on aerial. You can attach the poles. You can do some of these things. It just depends on each one. But for us, I think it was very great relationship we had with the city and the View Carré Commission. They worked with us. We listened to their comments and tried to adapt to their requirements so it would blend and become part of the environment. So I think it was a great relationship, great working relationship. And then when we came back to them last year and talking about adding nodes for the additional coverage and capacity requirements, it was very well received because of the experience we had with their first 14 and how we worked together. And then when we came back to ask for 13 more, it was a very fast process. It was very expedited, understanding the Super Bowl was coming, but because of what we had done before and how we had worked well together.
Any other questions?
Hi, can you just go over the genesis of the bidding process? I imagine you went up against an Extenet or an American Tower, and you know what the criteria was that the city was looking for, and how you guys won it.
To my knowledge, there was no bidding process. There was a point in time where there was a competing entity, a competing group that came in to propose a similar system, but they backed off at some point, and that's where it ended.
Good. Any other questions? All right. If not, I will get. Please first join me in thanking our panelists. We appreciate it. Always good to hear a success story, and I believe one of the successes was there were only 3 public hearings instead of